Most e-commerce store owners think they're A/B testing the right way, but the truth is they aren't. If you've ever run A/B tests on your website and you didn't see any clear improvement in the results, then you probably are missing the key steps that make A/B testing work. For more than 7 years, I've been boosting conversion rates and maximizing revenue for e-commerce brands using effective A/B testing strategies. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can actually A/B test your e-commerce store the right way, so you can boost your conversions and make data-driven decisions to grow your business. So let's dive in. Now let's start with the most important distinction, and that is your revenue level. Because if you are doing 300,000 up to 3 million a year, you need a different strategy than if you are doing more than 3 million. So let me clarify this with some colors. And if you are in this first range, 300,000 up to 3 million, what's very important is that you focus on big changes. Now, you will often hear that when you do A/B testing, you actually need to make small changes because you need to know what the impact is of your change. And if you're having like 5 different changes, you don't know what the impact is of all 5. Maybe one improved your conversion rate and the other one didn't, and therefore it's an inconclusive test and you don't know what happened. But the thing is, if you are in this range, then you need to have big changes, otherwise you won't get a significant result. And it's more important that you get a significant result, that you actually have an improvement or actually a decrease, because then you also know it doesn't work, than if you are constantly having tests where you don't know what actually happened because nothing really changed. So it's better to have a big change and you don't really know what each element did, but you at least have an improvement, than that you have no effect at all. While if you are above 3 million, you definitely need to make smaller changes or subtle changes. And that is because it's very important that you know what each small change does. Now, why is that more important for bigger brands or for brands that do more than 3 million? That is because even a 2% increase in your conversion rate or a decrease has a big impact. If you're doing 10 million, then a 2% increase in conversion rate really moves the needle. It's more than 200K a year. But if you are doing like 300,000 a year, you have a 2% increase. It's just a few $1,000s that makes it a bit of an impact on a yearly basis. That is not a lot. So you need to make sure that you at least have an increase in conversion rate of at least 10%, so that you can actually move the needle. Now, I don't want to downplay the fact that you need to know the impact of your changes, but again, it is just so important that you at least have an uplift or a decrease, so you know it doesn't work. And if you're having these small changes on a small website, then you just have a lot of tests that don't really move the needle and it doesn't get you anywhere. Well, if you have this amount of revenue or more, then you definitely will have a big impact, even if the uplift is just 2%. And let me just write it here because it's super important. You need to know the impact. It's super important because that will help you with your future testing. Because if you know that that small change increased your conversion rate, then you can also apply it to other pages, for example. Now, the second distinction between the two is the KPIs that you need to track. And for smaller brands, you need to track secondary KPIs. But for the bigger brands, they can really work with the primary KPIs. Of course, you ideally look at the primary KPIs. You want to look at the things that matter most, which is your conversion rate and your revenue. You need to know that your revenue is increasing. But the thing is that if you are a smaller brand, you don't have that many transactions a month. And you would need to think of that you need to have approximately 250 conversions per variant. So if you're A/B testing, you need to have at least 500 conversions in your test. And if you're looking at purchases and you're at 300K a year, then you need to run your test for too long in order to draw conclusions. While if you're looking at secondary KPIs, so KPIs that are a bit less important, for example, add to carts and your bounce rate, then you can collect more data. Because the further away you are from the purchase, the more data points you can collect. There will be fewer purchases than add to carts. So what you can do here, if you are a more smaller brand, is look at those secondary KPIs. You want to see, okay, does this increase the add to cart rate? Or does this lower our bounce rate? Or does this increase the number of pages that people view, if that's important for your brand? Well, if you are doing 3 million or more, then you can easily look at, okay, I just need to know if the revenue increases, right? It doesn't matter what my add to cart rate does. As long as more people buy, as long as they spend more, as long as my revenue increases, that is what counts. Now there's one caveat here when you look at secondary KPIs, is that you still need to look at what your primary KPI does. So if you're focusing on increasing your add to cart rate, you still need to look at what does it do to my revenue, what does it do to the orders that are being placed. Because it can be the case that your add to cart rate goes up, but that the orders go down. For example, if you are removing your shipping costs from the product page, you can maybe see that your add to cart rate increases because fewer people, the people won't even see anymore that there is an additional cost with shipping. So they might add more products to the cart, but then they go to the checkout and they suddenly are surprised with the extra amount that they need to pay. And they don't like surprise costs. Like nobody likes to be surprised with extra costs. So even though that more people can add something to the cart, in the end, because you made that change, more people will actually drop off at the checkout because they're annoyed with the extra cost. And therefore, it won't be a good change. Yes, your add to cart rate will increase, but your purchases will go down and your revenue will go down. So always look at what it does to your primary KPI. If you see that your bounce rate, for example, drops and your purchases go up or they at least stay the same, then it can still be a good change to execute. But always look, what does it do to my revenue? That's the most important part. Now, the third distinction between the two is the runtime. So you need to think of 4 to 6 weeks for a smaller brand and 2 weeks for a brand that does more than 3 million. Now, what do I mean with this? Well, you need to have a certain amount of data, like I said before, in order to draw a conclusion. Now, if you are using a metric like bounce rate, you can already collect a lot of data points in a shorter amount of time. But you'll need to look at how long do I need to run my test in order for it to be valid. And if you have not a lot of data, you really need to think of 4 to 6 weeks in order to run your test. While if you're doing more than 3 million, you can run for 2 weeks. And you can say, okay, but we are doing 50 million a year. Can we do it in 1 week? Well, you can, because you get a lot of traffic, you get a lot of transactions to support the findings for your primary KPI. But we still recommend to ideally test for 2 weeks because in 1 week, a lot of things can happen. There can be external factors like the weather, like promotions, something that a competitor does, that can affect the A/B test. Well, the chance of external factors impacting your A/B test is smaller when your date range is at least 2 weeks. So that is the recommendation, to at least run your test 2 weeks. And just take into account that when you are a smaller brand, you need to let it run for more, so you can collect more data and you are more sure that your test is valid. Now, these are 3 distinctions between smaller and bigger brands, but there's also some commonality between them, and let me highlight those. Now, the first very important thing that you will need to do, and let me draw this out here, there are actually 4. The first one is data. You need to make sure that your tests are based on data, because if you're just going to change something without knowing if it's actually a problem, you will spend and you will lose a lot of time because you are just testing things that might not have an impact. If you know that, hey, on my collection pages, I have an issue because people are not clicking on products, then you are tackling a page that clearly has an issue. Or if you're noticing that a lot of people are complaining about a certain question that they have and they cannot find the answer, then you know, okay, I need to communicate that, for example, on the product page. And therefore, you're tackling a real problem. If you are just going to change your call to action, or if you're going to increase the search bar, or you're going to change your About Us page without knowing if it's actually an issue, you're basically doing like throwing spaghetti on a wall kind of technique, and you just wait to see what sticks. And that is going to be a huge waste of your time. Now, the reason why brands often don't like to collect data is because it takes time. They're like, okay, I need to spend, for example, a month collecting data to realize what motivates my audience, what doubts they have, what usability issues I have. It's a lot of time. But the thing is that time will pay you back because you will actually focus on things that matter. So you can say, okay, I don't do data and I start right away. I can already immediately A/B test today. But after 6 months, you might not have made any significant improvement. While if you do a month of data collection and then you start testing, then in that second month, you might already have a winning test, or in the third month. So is it actually a waste of time if you collect data? Definitely not. So you need to make sure what your users are struggling with, what motivates them, and what pages are your bottlenecks. Now, the second thing that is super important is to work with hypotheses. You need to know and you need to be able to learn from your results. You need to know what actually just happened. And the best way to illustrate this is to give an example of coming up with an A/B test idea and then creating the hypothesis afterwards. And that shows you that you always need to make sure that you do things based on an hypothesis. Now, let me give you the example of a search bar. Let's say that you decide to make the search bar larger. And then you're like, okay, wait, what could be the hypothesis here? Why are we testing this? And you can say, well, if the search bar is bigger, if it's more prominent, then more people will search, because usually people that search, they convert better. But then when you make that reasoning and you think, but do I actually know if people that search on my site convert better? And if you then do your research, or if you check your data that you collected and you see that people that search on your website actually don't convert better, then it is of course a test that you shouldn't run. You should actually focus first on improving that search functionality instead of making it bigger. So that shows you why it is important. Also, what we always do is to work with an H-null, meaning a null hypothesis. And officially what that means is that you are coming up with the reason why there wouldn't be any effect. We use it a bit different. We use it in a sense of, okay, why would it not win? Why would it lose? That really helps us to look very critical at our idea. For example, if you say we need to have a sticky call to action because people don't really click on a call to action, they kind of skim over it, they don't really see it, it's not prominent enough. Let's make it sticky. And that will then increase add to carts, and therefore people will go through that funnel and more of them will reach a checkout and end up converting. If you then make your null hypothesis, why would it lose? You could say, okay, if we make it sticky, especially on mobile, we reduce that viewport, like we will block a part of the page because there's always something sticky there. Or you could say more people will actually click that button too soon because it's so prominent. They are more likely to click on the add to cart button without having seen important section of the page that could actually help them, motivate them, and actually could help in the conversion when they're in the checkout. You know, now they're clicking too fast on the add to cart button, and they therefore have still doubts and uncertainties in the checkout because they didn't see the entire product page, and therefore more of them drop off. So that makes you also think, okay, should we make it sticky? Or should we maybe just make the bottom bigger or more contrasting? So it forces you to think more critical about your A/B testing idea, and it also helps you to come up with a better solution. Now, the third part, which is super important, is to segment your data. You need to look at the performance for especially mobile and desktop. You can segment on a lot of different dimensions like traffic source, etc. But the one that is most practical is to segment based on mobile or desktop, because a lot of changes, they can have a different effect on mobile or desktop for two main reasons. One is that the dimensions are different. On mobile, you have less space. So if you add something, people already will have to scroll more. Because the viewport is smaller, whatever you add is also more prominent because there's not a lot of stuff left or right or above or underneath it that can distract users. So it is a different experience for people if they see the website on desktop or on mobile. Second is that the behavior is different on the devices. On desktop, we see that on average, people spend twice as much time than on mobile. People are also more willing to do some research on desktop, while on mobile, they do more intuitive actions. So they're more vulnerable or sensitive to social proof, etc. So people can react differently to your changes depending on the device that they are on. So therefore, it's important that if you have your test results that you check, okay, what did it do on mobile and what did it do on desktop? You can, for example, have a test where the conversion rate doesn't really change much, but when you segment on device, you can actually see that on desktop it increased by 5%, but on mobile it might have decreased by 3%, making it a bit of an inconclusive test, while it actually would be a winner or is a winner for desktop. So therefore, you would miss out on a winning test. Or it could also be opposite, that you actually are implementing a change on a device where it's actually not working well. So be sure that you know what it does on mobile and on desktop. Now, the fourth one is to really act properly when something is a win or a loss. When it's a winner, implement it. Don't wait too long. Make sure to implement it right away. Profit from that winning test, from the increase that it gives you. And also think, okay, can we make it even better? For example, let's go back to that search, because we have had situations with our clients where we made the search bar more prominent, we made it bigger, and that won. And in the follow-up test, we made it even bigger, and that also won. And it actually increased the conversion rate even more. Now, then we had a follow-up test where we made it even more prominent, and then when it was too big, too prominent, and it didn't work. So, of course, at some point it stops, but you always have to look, okay, can we squeeze more out of this winning test. Don't just stop when you have a winner. See if you can improve it even further. If it's a loss or if it's inconclusive, like the test didn't do much, then revisit the hypothesis and your data. Was this really an issue? If so, was the execution optimal? If we go back to that add to cart example, maybe you made it sticky, but maybe that execution wasn't optimal. Maybe you should have made it just more prominent, or should have just made the button a more distinctive color. So check if the execution is actually a good one or if there's another way of doing this. Now don't try and improve the test over and over again. So of course, check if you could do it better and make it a winner next time. But if it loses for the second or third or fourth time, at some point you have to stop and say, like, okay, maybe this is not an issue, and move on to the next. Don't try to make something work if it's time and time again doesn't work. Now, these are 4 important things that work for smaller and for bigger brands. It's something that you really need to take into account. But there's also something that you really need to be careful of. And there are actually 3 things that you need to avoid. So please don't test too many changes at once. If you test too many changes at once, you don't know what the impact is. So of course, if you are a smaller brand and you need to do a big change, be sure that you also contain it. For example, if you are doing something on the image gallery, then don't also do something with your product descriptions. Those are 2 different things. Make sure that you have maybe a different image gallery, or if you're focusing on your product description, make sure that you have a different copywriting framework that you apply. But don't test too many different elements at the same time. Yes, the change needs to be big, but you don't need to change everything. Then it really turns into a bit of a mumbo jumbo and you don't really know what impact everything has. You can say, okay, this clearly did work for my image gallery, or this clearly didn't work for my FAQ section, and then you can try something else. But if you're changing like 5 big elements or 3 big elements, then it's going to be very challenging. The third thing that you need to avoid is to stop the test too early. We always say don't stop the test too early, but also don't let the test run too long if you are a bigger brand. If you're doing, for example, 10 million a year and you have a test running that decreases your conversion rate by 20%, that can happen, like you maybe do something really the wrong way, then you don't need to wait for 2 weeks in order to pull the plug. If you see that after a couple of days the decrease is huge, don't wait for too long. You can just say, okay, this definitely doesn't work. Our conversion rate is tanking by 20% for 2 days now. We need to stop the test. So give it at least 2 days. And if it's doing well, also don't stop and say like, okay, this was a winner. No, wait and sit it out. Because what sometimes happens is that it begins positive, but then there's a regression to the mean, meaning there's no really significant change, or a test can flip. So make sure that you give it the appropriate time. But also don't stick your head in the sand. If it's costing you a lot of money, then just pull the plug. Don't have a test running just to know that's definitely a loser. If the decrease is too high, and it's too high for at least 2 days for bigger brands, stop it. And the third one, and not the least, this is super crucial, because if you don't do this, if you don't do a QA, then the whole A/B testing process that you do, you can just put it in the bin. You need to make sure that your test is working properly on all the devices, on all the major devices and the major browsers and operating systems. Safari is, for example, a browser that usually is a bit different than the rest, and a lot of users are on Safari. So if you're checking your test and you see that, hey, it works fine on my Chrome browser on my desktop, let's put it live, then you're missing the mark. It can definitely be the case that on Safari it doesn't work, something breaks, and therefore your test will be invalid. Besides that, you need to make sure it also really works on different devices. Oftentimes when you create a test, it will look great on desktop, but it won't look great on mobile, or vice versa. You need to make sure that you check all the devices to see if actually things work as they should. If you change the filters on your collection page, do they still work when I also apply a sorting? If I go to a different page, if I go to the second page, for example, does it still work? You need to make sure that this test doesn't break, because if the test breaks, then your test is invalid and you might think it's a loser. But actually the change was a big improvement. It's just that the test broke. So that's why people didn't convert, because either they couldn't convert, or they had a lot of friction because the design looked so weird, or the call to action just fell off the page because of an issue that was on mobile. So really do a proper quality assessment to make sure that your test is working on all the devices and operating systems that you're running it on. Now you know how to properly run an A/B test, and also what to do if you're a smaller brand or if you're a bigger brand. But even with these steps, you might still wonder, okay, what should I test? Or how do I analyze the data? Or what are my next steps? When do I need to take action? If you want me to guide you through the process and make sure that your website is optimized for conversions, click the link below and schedule a free call with me today. And if you're not ready for that yet, check out this video where I show you 7 ways that help you make your landing page a money printing machine.